What is today Latin America was once many native nations. Spain, Portugal, France, England, the Dutch and Danish all invaded. They carried out genocide after genocide and enslaved both natives and Africans. After independence, most new governments were still white-dominated, with more genocides against natives in nations like Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. European powers hold on to some territories even today, and kept invading to take their colonies back. The United States invaded too, overthrowing or trying to overthrow over 60 governments, the last attempt in the year 2020 in Venezuela. The U.S. also took half of Mexico's land and a tenth of its people, then Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. There is a long history of many Americans fearing and hating Latinos. Latin America's image and reality is often one of instability, poverty, drug cartels, revolutions, corruption, and refugees. But it did not have to be this way. Latin America could remain all or mostly native nations. I spoke about this in detail in the previous series, What If Natives Won? Poverty, white domination, and foreign invasions could have been stopped, prevented, or limited. The U.S. could have been more Latino culturally, with higher numbers of Latinos. The U.S. could have been less racist, less dominating, or the U.S. could be defeated. Some Latin American nations could even become regional or world powers. There's a huge lack of alternate history about Latin America and Latinos. So much alternate history is Europe-centered, mostly because so much history and history teaching is Europe-centered. This series is dedicated to scenarios, points of departure, and possibilities of Latin American victory within Latin America, and a more Latino or less racist American society. My name is Al Carroll. I'm Associate Professor of History at Northern Virginia Community College. I've written mostly about wars, veterans, human rights, and genocide. My next history book will be Genocide Denial in America, about the 7 genocides against indigenous people that took place in the U.S. that most people were never taught about, don't know, or deny. I've also written some science fiction, mostly alternate history. One story, Timely Saviors, appeared in a short story collection, The Witness Paradox. I'm also, together with Rob Schmidt of Bluecorn Comics, editing and putting out a short story alternate history collection, What If Natives Won? Or Killing Columbus. I've also written a sci-fi alternate history book, The Man in Black, the first of a series. In the 1930s and 40s, Brazil was brutally ruled by dictator Getulio Vargas. That's him in the center, smoking a cigar, after he led the military to overthrow its democracy. Vargas was born into wealth, a lawyer from a powerful family of coffee plantation owners. The excuse he gave for becoming dictator was to prevent communism, after a series of small failed revolts, most of them with never more than a few hundred rebels. In fact, Vargas had just lost an election to Luis Prestes, one of the revolt leaders. The overthrow was simply Vargas stealing the election. Vargas founded an outright fascist regime, the Estado Novo, or New State. Vargas used Brazil's fascist, the integralist, shown here giving their own fascist salute, as enforcers. Congress was outlawed, and the Constitution thrown out. Dissenters were imprisoned without trial. Political parties were banned. Brazil was under martial law. As World War II came closer, Brazil was reluctantly pushed into the war. Brazil was neutral at first. Vargas and much of the military and his supporters were pro-fascist. Then trade with the Axis became more difficult. Brazil gave in to Roosevelt's push and allowed U.S. bases. Finally, Brazil supposedly declared war against the Axis powers, even sending an expedition force. But that was mostly for show. It was supposed to be 100,000 men, but was actually less than 26,000. It took 2 years to send it, and when they arrived, Brazilian troops were discovered to be not only untrained, but completely unarmed. They had to have American weapons, officers, and medical corps. They didn't enter the war until 6 months before fighting in Europe was over. At war's end, Brazil's veterans were kept under close watch. Vargas was afraid they would overthrow him, and the rest of the military overthrew him anyway. 5 years after the war, Vargas was legally elected. But his only opposition was 2 parties that had his former allies as candidates. Real opposition from anyone on the left was banned or boycotting the election. Vargas then ordered the murder of an opponent, and he was caught. And Vargas shot himself to avoid prison. It took a decade for the leftist opposition to gain much strength against Vargas's party and the military. And then the military overthrew this democracy and ruled it for 2 more decades. What if Vargas joined his fellow fascists during World War II? Strategically, it'd be best for Vargas before Pearl Harbor. Germany and Italy may send advisors to train the military and weapons to arm them. This may push for the U.S. to join the war earlier. But even with Italian fascist and Nazi German aid, Brazil would be no match for American Navy and troops. Brazil had perhaps 50,000 troops, to the United States 125,000. Its navy was obsolete and far smaller than the U.S.'s. If the U.S. invades after Pearl Harbor, its Atlantic Navy is still strong enough to easily defeat Brazil's. Brazil's dictatorship also had strong opposition. It won election only a few years before. Communists and liberals had both taken part in armed revolts. There were leftist sentiments among some of its military. They will revolt again and side with this American invasion. American occupation of Brazil would be much like MacArthur's occupation of Japan after World War II. MacArthur ordered a new Japanese constitution. It had the right to vote for women. It had rights for unions. It broke up capitalist cartels and monopolies. And the military was reformed. The fascists were kicked out, and civilian control of the government was made permanent. Japan's constitution even forbids the military from invading other nations, or even leaving the nation. Brazil probably would not see the need for the last. But the nation of Brazil will make sure no generals are ever dictators again. Vargas and his top people will face war crimes trials. Vargas will likely be executed for mass murder and torture, and so will most of his top generals, his military court-martials, and his police leaders, because they killed arbitrarily. Brazil will be a better place for having punished its dictators, something that only a few other nations in Latin America have done, like Peru. Brazil won't be a paradise or a perfect democracy. It will simply become more democratic several decades sooner. Reactionaries and even racist fascists like Bolsonaro still will be around. Right-wing coups like the one that threw Dilma Rousseff out of office are still possible, or elite judges blocking popular candidates like Lula on flimsy political grounds. But almost anything will be better than Brazil's military dictatorships, first under Vargas, and then under a series of generals from the 1960s to the 1980s. The second dictatorship exterminated 80 Amazon tribes, killing over 100,000 Amazon Indians. Both sets of dictatorships mass imprisoned, mass tortured, censored, and crushed all opposition. And the myth, the so-called Brazilian miracle, ignores that Brazil is incredibly unequal and deeply racist, though many won't admit to it. Brazil's whites live like the wealthiest parts of the world. Its non-whites are as poor as the poorest parts of the world, often living side by side. Brazil also has more cops murdering more civilians than literally anywhere else in the world. Almost all of Brazil's cops are white, and almost all the victims of police violence are black or mixed race. Brazil's cops murder more people just in Rio de Janeiro than American cops do in all of the United States. Breaking the military dictatorship, where cops were literally the judge, jury, and executioner, can break the murderous practices of Brazil's cops. Brazil would be a less brutal society, and perhaps a more equal one, if America had kicked out its fascist dictator. This is the end of the video. Please repost freely, like, quote, and comment. This has been Latin American Victory. Next time we will discuss what if there was no Cold War in Latin America.